Okay. Yeah, Shill has spoken to the chapter several times on a wide variety of topics. He has his eclectic interests for sure. He runs a YouTube channel that focuses on various obscure items in history, things that might otherwise be forgotten. He produces plays. He researches history. He makes art. He does other things. He's a very interesting guy.
I sing, I dance. No,
Yeah,
not really.
He probably does. But in any case, please welcome to Leslie.
All right. Well, that saves me from having to introduce myself, so we can dive right in. So tonight I'm going to be talking about a tragic and largely forgotten episode in Canadian aerospace history. Not forgotten among this crowd, but forgotten enough. Everybody talks about the Avro Aero and the CF100, but everybody forgets about Avro's other project. So everybody's familiar with this photograph. So this was taken by Toronto Star reporter Herb Knott in June 1959, and this, of course, shows all of these CF105 arrows being cut up for scrap. This is after the project was canceled on February 20th, the infamous Black Friday. Very little remains of these aircraft. The largest section is RL-206, the nose and cockpit section in the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. But has anybody here ever been to the storage facility directly across from the museum? Anybody ever toured through there? Yeah, it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of really cool stuff back there that the public doesn't tend to see very often, including this rather less impressive looking nose section, which if you didn't know what it was, you'd probably walk right past it thinking it was, I don't know, a DC-9 or something like that. But no, this is all that's left of the Avro Canada C102 Jetliner. Now, for me, this is a far more poignant and really infuriating artifact than RL-206, because while you can argue all day whether it was justified canceling the Aero, whether it was too expensive, whether it would have been obsolete by the time it entered service, you can argue that all day, but what is not debatable is that the Jetliner was a truly revolutionary aircraft, and it had the potential to put Avro, as well as Canadian aerospace in general, on the map in a way that's difficult to imagine today. It was only the second purpose-built jet transport to take to the skies, and it could have pioneered and dominated the regional feeder liner market in North America. It was 10 years ahead of pretty much any other competitor that it had. It smashed records pretty much every time it flew. Every pilot who flew it loved it. We had airlines across North America and elsewhere in the world lining up to buy it. And yet, less than 2 years after it made its maiden flight, the project was canceled, and then in 1956, they cut up the only prototype for scrap, the same as they would do to all the Arrows just 3 years later. So the question is, why? What killed the jetliner? And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. So our story... Oh, I'm missing a photo right here. He is the minister of everything, but he is nowhere. So our story begins in 1945 with the creation of Avro Canada Ltd. So this started out as National Steel Car. They had a factory at Malton, just outside of Toronto. It's now Pearson Airport. In 1938, it was commandeered to become a shadow factory for the British. So it was producing airframes and parts for the Handley Page Hampton, the Hawker Hurricane, the Avro Anson, and the Westland Lysander. In 1942, it was nationalized and turned into Victory Aircraft Limited, where they focused on the manufacture of Ansons and Lancaster Mark 10s. I have some statistics here. They produced, by the end of the war, 3,197 Ansons, 430 Lancasters, and then small numbers of Lancaster derivatives like the Lancastrian, the York, and the Lincoln. Now, at the beginning of 1945, the war starting to wind down and demand for military aircraft started to fall off, a deal starts to be brokered between... So it was Fred Smyth, who was the director of aircraft production. He brokers a deal between C.D. Howe and Sir Roy Dobson, who was the head of Avro in England, part of the Hawker Siddeley group, whereby after the war, Hawker Siddeley will take over Victory Aircraft and turn it into a wholly owned Canadian subsidiary to be called Avro Canada Ltd. The deal is signed on December 1st, 1945, just a couple of months after the war ends. Now, by this time, the staff of Victory Aircraft has fallen from a maximum in 1944 of 9,500 people to only 300. So Hawker Siddeley has to send over a bunch of engineers and technicians from England to form the core of the design group at Avro, among them being Jim Floyd. And he would end up being a major part of most of Avro's projects, most notably the jetliner, which is what we'll be talking about, as well as the CF-105 Aero. So Floyd was born in 1914 in Manchester. He started working at age 15 as an apprentice machinist at Avro. His uncle knew Roy Dobson. It's good to have connections. I graduated with a degree in engineering from Manchester Technical College, and then he went into the more advanced apprenticeship program at Avro. He was then seconded to the design group of Roy Chadwick, and then finally as assistant test pilot to Billy Thorne, who was their main test pilot at the Woodford Aerodrome. In that capacity, he was involved in the design and flight testing of a number of important Avro designs, including the Manchester, the Lancaster, the York, and the Lincoln. And I do mean intimately. On one test flight of the York, a big section of the fuselage ripped out, and Floyd was almost sucked out into space. He applied to join the Royal Air Force twice. He was rejected twice. First time for health reasons, second time because Avro wouldn't let him go. But in 1946, he and Edgar Atkin, a fellow engineer, they were sent to Canada to form the main design team for Avro Canada Ltd. To give you an idea of how different air travel was at the time, they traveled by Avro Lancastrian, which was the passenger variant of the Lancaster, and they flew via the Azores. They landed in the Azores, one of the tires blew out, they didn't have any spares, they had to sleep out in the open on the airfield for 2 days until they could get tires in. And then they flew out to Newfoundland, and then to Montreal, and they caught a DC-3 to Malton. So very different. So the brand new company explored two main avenues for creating products and creating revenue, since the demand for military aircraft was falling quite sharply in the wake of the war. One of them was to meet the post-war demands of the Royal Canadian Air Force. This led to the development of the CF-100. The other was to produce a short to medium haul airliner for TCA, Trans-Canada Airlines, now Air Canada. Now, at the time, Avro knew that piston engines were on their way out, but turbine engines were still a new and relatively untested technology. So at first they wanted to go with an interim solution, which was gas turboprop engines, specifically the Armstrong's Whitworth Mamba. But when they started consulting with a bunch of engine companies, Rolls-Royce said, no, you need to use our new experimental AG65 axial flow turbojet, what would eventually become the Rolls-Royce Avon. And so the new C102 airliner became a pure jet transport, what could have been the very first in the world. So now the basic design and the first sales brochure was finished by Christmas 1945, less than a month after the company was even formed. So very quick turnaround. And so the next step was to go to TCA and see exactly what they wanted in an airliner. So on March 27th, 1946, Jim Floyd, Mario Pizzando, and Norman Ring, chief engineers at Avro, went and met in TCA chief engineer Jack Diamond here in Winnipeg, and they hashed out some requirements for the new aircraft. So they said it had to be able to carry 20 passengers or a 10,000-pound payload, have a still air range of 1,200 miles, full payload range in a 20-mile-per-hour headwind, 500 miles, cruising speed 400 miles per hour, had to be able to operate from a 4,000-foot runway, approach to the stall speed roughly similar to contemporary piston aircraft, of course, reliability, ease, and maintenance, and then operating costs comparable to existing transports. This is actually not bad for the time. You know, a little bit state-of-the-art, but doable, except for a couple of things. 4,000-foot runway is still very, very short. So would be a challenge to achieve that, as well as this approach to stall speed similar to piston-powered aircraft. And this is bleeding-edge technology at the time. Again, there has not yet been a pure jet-powered transport, so getting operating costs comparable to proven technology of props is going to be, again, a bit of a challenge. But nonetheless, TCA head Herbert Symington approves the project on April 9th, 1946. They expect the first deliveries of the jetliner in October 1948. So by the spring of the next year, in 1947, things are going along very well. They're making great progress on building a full-size wooden replica in one of the Avro hangars. They've got some of the pre-production tooling finished. And then the whole project runs into a huge snag. So the AJ-65, at the time that the jetliner was being proposed, it was still on a military secrets list, and Avro just hoped that it would be released to the public in time for them to finish the aircraft and deliver it to TCA. Well, in the spring of 1947, Rolls-Royce tells them, no, this thing's not going to be declassified anytime soon. It's back to the drawing boards. They had to find another engine. They couldn't find anything powerful enough where they could just use two. So what they ended up going with was the Rolls-Royce Derwent 5, and this was a very proven engine. It was used in the Gloucester Meteor. It had significantly less thrust. They had to use 4 of them. It was also, being a centrifugal rather than axial flow turbojet, it was much larger in diameter, and it was much heavier, and it consumed 13% more fuel. So not ideal, but there were some upsides. Avro designed the mountings for the engines in such a way that you could swap in a whole bunch of different engines very easily, so they could put in more efficient units later down the line. As I said, the Derwent was a very well-proven engine. It had 100,000 military flight hours by that time, so it's very reliable. Also, the 4-engine configuration. Actually, you know what? I'm going to pass around the model here. Be careful with that. If you can see the actual configuration of the jetliner. The 4-engine configuration has some advantages, mainly in asymmetric thrust when one of the engines went out. And they found that even with both engines on one side completely out, you could correct the thrust asymmetry with manual rudder. So it eliminated the need for fully powered controls, made the whole design a lot simpler and cheaper to produce. So in the end, it was something of a net positive. But so they finished up the redesign in September of 1947, the gross weight of the aircraft was increased to around 55,000 pounds. Again, things seem to be going well. Then another gigantic spanner gets thrown in the works, this time courtesy of TCA. As you see, Herbert Symington, he goes back on his original agreement, and he throws a whole bunch of super unreasonable demands at Avro. This is what he wanted in the contract. He wanted Avro to guarantee a $350,000 fixed price on each aircraft, wanted them to observe a 3-year moratorium on selling the aircraft to any other airline, and then if they managed to reduce the price per aircraft, they had to pay back the difference to TCA. And then also they had to pay for all the testing up to and including 1 year after TCA adopted the aircraft, so that, in Symington's words, we can learn how to successfully operate a jet aircraft without having to pay for such experience the hard way. He's saying the quiet part out loud. And on top of all of this, TCA refused to actually confirm that they would buy the aircraft or how many they would actually buy. You'll recognize this as completely ridiculous, but it gets worse. Because in 1948, TCA puts out a report saying that because Canadian airports are not adopting instrument landing systems quickly enough, the jetliner would be restricted to visual flight rules and would have to carry a huge fuel reserve as per industry standards. How much fuel? Well, for example, on a flight between Toronto and New York, the jetliner was expected to burn something like 9,500 pounds of fuel. Per regulations, it would have to carry 20,000 pounds of fuel on top of that, which makes the gross weight ridiculous. It reduces the actual effective range of the aircraft to something like 300 miles. So it would not be able to fly from Toronto to Winnipeg, very common route, without stopping off in Thunder Bay or Fort William, Port Arthur, whatever it would have been called at the time. And then again, it gets even worse. Just when you thought you couldn't get worse, Symington says, okay, well, if you can make an aircraft that can fly nonstop between Toronto and Winnipeg at 500 miles per hour, not 400, then we'll pay for 2 prototypes, we'll test them, and then maybe we'll buy it. So it becomes very clear at this point that TCA is very skittish about the whole thing. They don't want to stick their necks out. They don't want to be the first airline in North America to adopt a jet transport. And indeed, Symington's successor, Gordon McGregor, would state this outright. And so what they were trying to do was either shift all of the risk onto Avro or basically bully them, pester them into dropping the whole thing. And eventually that's what TCA did. They said, we're not really interested. So right even before construction on the prototype had begun, the jetliner seemed dead in the water. But rescue came in the form of C.D. Howe, who is still not appearing in this picture. So C.D. Howe, he wants to boost the Canadian aircraft industry, and so he earmarks $1.5 million of government funds towards the completion of the project, at least to the prototype phase. The hope being that either TCA will change its mind or Avro will succeed in selling the aircraft to other airlines. Meanwhile, across the pond, Roy Dobson is having a lot of trouble selling his company's new aircraft, which is the Avro Tudor. This is a pressurized 26-passenger variant of the Lancaster. By the time it comes out, it is woefully obsolete, and very few of them are sold. I think only 38, and they're only operated by small regional and charter airliners. It was kind of a disaster for Avro. And so this whole thing really made him skittish about embarking on another commercial transport project. And to be fair to Sir Roy, the standard setup, the standard deal at the time of airlines working with aircraft manufacturers to shepherd a new airliner design from blueprint to adoption was highly risky. And by the end of the 1940s, all of the major aircraft manufacturers in North America had collectively lost some $50 million in lost contract deals. But he finally came around on the jetliner, and he earmarked $500,000 worth of Hawker-Siddeley funds towards the aircraft's completion. But he emphasized what the high stakes at play in this. In a meeting in 1948 with Jim Floyd, he told Floyd, "Don't let the knockers get you down, Jimmy, but you'd better make sure that when this 102 of yours flies, it's going to be so damn good that we're going to have airlines queuing up for the thing. I'm staking my reputation on that, so don't let me down. It's got to be perfect. No pressure." So here's the overall design of the jetliner. You can also see it in the model that's being passed around. Overall, a very conventional design, and this is done on purpose, with the straight wings and fairly conventional layout, because already they were dealing with untested technology in the form of jet propulsion as well as high cabin pressurization for use at high altitudes. So the Avro engineers decided to take a very conservative approach that they wouldn't give themselves more problems to solve than they really needed to. So as you can see, we have the 4 Rolls-Royce Derwent 5 engines in these close pods. This was a very common way of mounting engines at the time. You saw it in the Havilland Comet. It wasn't until the 707 that you had the more familiar pylon mounting become rather standard. So as you can see, the engine is mounted at the front, and then you have this long jet pipe that curves down and around the wing spar, which greatly simplifies the structure of the wing itself, and also makes it very flexible. You can swap in all sorts of engines in there. Originally, the pods were supposed to be slung under the wings, but wind tunnel testing revealed that this interfered with airflow over the wings, so they moved them up to sort of this mid-span position. The lack of a propeller meant that the engines could be much lower to the ground and made the landing gear much shorter and more robust. It also put the engines much closer to the ground, made them much easier to maintain without any special ladders or platforms. Crews who worked on the jetliner absolutely loved this feature. So wind tunnel testing also revealed that they had to move the horizontal stabilizer up to get it out of the jet wash. Most of the controls were unpowered, although they did have a little bit of hydraulic boost. The ailerons were hydraulic, but then the elevators and the rudder were mostly manual. They actually had 2 surfaces, a split surface, and the inboard one had a bit of hydraulic boost. But like I said, they found that they could actually correct for 2 engines out on one side with manual trim. So during actual flight testing, they locked that inboard section in place. They really didn't need it. A couple of other things to point out. Round windows to increase visibility, but also reduce stress concentration during pressurization. The windscreen, they didn't put any windscreen wipers on it. Instead, they put a rain repellent coating on it. And then finally, you'll probably notice this little chin scoop right here. That's the cabin air intake. So here we see the aircraft taking shape inside the Avro hangar. You can see the extensive reinforcement as well as the circular cross-section of the fuselage. This was to contain the cabin pressurization, which was fairly high because they were going at much higher altitudes than most airliners. So it was equivalent to 3,000 feet at 30,000 feet altitude. So quite a pressure differential for the time. Now, there are a couple of snags during construction. For example, during one vibration test, the ailerons nearly shook off, and they found that it was a lack of damping in the servos, the boost servos. So they temporarily solved the problem using the most advanced of all materials, silly putty. No, they actually stuffed silly putty in to make dampers. Apparently, it worked perfectly. They used it for pretty much all the flight tests. Also, when they fired up the engines for the first time in the pods, the temperature differential caused the pods to warp and split and pop rivets, and they had to redesign them. But by the spring of 1949, the prototype had been assembled. It was given the registration number of CFEJDX, X for experimental. Final inspection was on July 25th, 1949. Taxi and flight tests were scheduled for early in August. Unfortunately, a little bit of an upset. On the 27th of July, they were beaten into the air by the prototype de Havilland Comet. But this wasn't as much of an upset as many people make it out to be. For one thing, the Comet only made a short hop and didn't even leave the length of the runway on that day. Also, it was never in direct competition with the jetliner. The Comet was meant for long distances, intercontinental travel, though bridging the empire. But the jetliner was a regional airliner from the start, so the two were complementary designs. They weren't in competition with one another. Also, these were the first two purpose-built jet transports, because there actually had been piston-powered aircraft converted to jet propulsion that had flown before this, the Nien Lancastrian and the Nien Viking. Finally, before we move on, the first Comets were powered by Rolls-Royce Ghosts, but then from the Comet 2 onwards, they were powered by the now declassified Rolls-Royce Avon that the jetliner had originally been designed around. So they got to have it in the end. So finally, early August, we start getting taxi trials and flight trials. So this was complicated slightly by the fact that the Malton airport authorities in their infinite wisdom decided to tear up the main runway for maintenance at that exact moment. So the Avro team only had a very short runway to work with. It was also unseasonably hot that August, meaning that the takeoff roll was significantly extended, and they had very little in terms of margin of error for the runway to work with. Also, it affected the tires on pretty much every taxi test, because they didn't have the ABS brakes installed. The tires burst and they had to be replaced. So it was a very lengthy, very frustrating process. Same thing happened during the first takeoff attempt on August 8th. They did three taxi tests, I believe, and then they tried to do a takeoff, and then the pilot, Jimmy Orell, in the middle right here, he was on loan from England. He decided he didn't have enough runway. He put on the brakes and the tires burst. This kept happening. It happened again on the 10th, and this is when he decided, screw it, we're not going to do a short hop. I'm going to actually take this thing into the air. And that's exactly what he did. Along with his co-pilot, Don Rogers, and his flight engineer, Bill Baker, they took off from the runway. They went up to 13,000 feet. They flew around for about an hour, and they landed. And they said it was one of the most perfect first flights they had ever taken. And here I can show you some of their testimonials. You can read on the screen. From the first flight, they absolutely loved the aircraft. They found it very docile, just a pleasure to fly. Another thing that they noted on was how quiet it was. Even with not all the insulation installed inside the cabin, they could hear the propellers of the B-25 Mitchell chase aircraft, and they could also tell that they had a bad bearing in their gyro compass. So the first flight took place while most of the Avro staff were away on summer vacation, so they arranged a second flight on the 16th for everyone. Unfortunately, that did not go as well. When they came in for a landing, they realized the main gear would not drop. The airport manager at Malton said, well, I don't want you crash landing on my airfield, go ditch in Lake Ontario. So they told them nuts to that, and they made a perfect belly landing. There was very little damage to the aircraft. It was very quickly repaired and no direct injuries, though Bill Baker did bust a rib trying to pull the emergency release handle for the landing gear. But no harm otherwise. Aircraft was first publicly exhibited in October of 1949. By this time, Jimmy Orell had left. He flew the first 16 test flights for a total of 21 hours before he was replaced by Don Rogers for the rest of the program. And then in November of 1949, they made a high-altitude, high-speed flight. They went up to 30,000 feet and 678 miles per hour, equivalent to Mach 0.73. This is not only the first jet transport to break the 500-mile-per-hour barrier, that is the single greatest increase in transport aircraft performance in North American history. It has not been beaten since, and overall it is only the second, I believe, after the Concorde and the Tupolev 144. Just this sheer increase in performance from propeller to jet power. And the jetliner seemed to break records whenever it flew. One of the first that it broke was going from Rockcliffe in Ottawa to Malton in 36 minutes. It previously took twice that long with a piston-powered aircraft. It was demonstrated alongside the prototype CF-100. This was viewed by the Governor General as well as Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who were very impressed. It flew from Toronto to Chicago, to New York, Chicago, and back to Toronto in 4 hours, 34 minutes, and then from Toronto to Winnipeg and back within a 24-hour turnaround. So much faster than anything that had come before. And I think on one of the flights to Miami, the pilot actually overshot Miami because he wasn't used to it taking that little time. He thought he had hours to go and he'd already overflown the city and he had to turn back. But at the same time, as the jetliner was gaining notoriety, and by the way, jetliner was invented for this aircraft, that term. It's generic now, but it's like Kleenex or Xerox. It was created for this aircraft. So while the aircraft's fame was growing, Avro management had a bit of a chicken and the egg problem on their hands because, number one, they wanted to be able to fly the aircraft and demonstrate it with passengers on board, executives from airlines, but they couldn't lock down the design of the aircraft unless they knew what airlines wanted, because they couldn't count on what TCA wanted. They were out of the game at this point. So they called the Department of Transport and they sent over a test pilot, Des Murphy, who flew the aircraft for 2 months in early 1950. He was very impressed. He issued them with a conditional certificate, which says you can fly the aircraft with passengers on board, but you have to fly out of airfields no smaller than Malton. You have to stay to 20,000 feet. You have to obey visual flight rules, and also you can't carry paying passengers, and the passengers you do carry have to sign a waiver. Not ideal, but at least they could demonstrate the aircraft. And demonstrated they did when they decided to send the jetliner to New York to participate in an air show organized by the Society of Automotive Engineers. On April 18th, 1950, the jetliner took off from Malton with a number of people aboard, including the new president of TCA, Gordon McGregor. He was starting to change his mind at this point. They took off at 9:30 a.m. They landed at Idlewild Airport, today JFK, 1 hour later. Again, this smashed the record for that route. And aboard, and as well as VIPs, they also carried a number of gifts for the delegates from New York, including a scroll, an indigenous headdress, and a still smoking peace pipe. The idea being that it would still be smoking by the time they landed, showing how short the flight was. It actually went out during the flight, and Bill Baker had to secretly relight it before they deplaned. And so they were met by a welcoming committee comprising Mr. James O'Brien, who was representing the mayor of New York, William O'Dwyer, and Kenneth Green, the Canadian Consul General in New York. After they posed some photos with some lovely ladies in national costume, as was the style at the time, they were taken by limousine to Manhattan, where they attended receptions at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and the Canadian Club. Also aboard the aircraft were 15,000 letters. This was the first jet airmail ever carried anywhere. And it was actually delivered personally to the aircraft by the postmaster of Toronto. And when the aircraft landed, the concept of jet propulsion was so new that the manager of Idlewild Airport thought that the jet blast would light the tarmac on fire and just generally cause mayhem. So he forced the crew to park the aircraft at the far end of the apron, and he ordered trays put under the engines to catch the supposedly self-igniting fuel. And actually, it's worth pointing out that wherever the jetliner flew, they had to arrange for fuel to be delivered there ahead of them, because at the time, all transport aircraft were running on ordinary avgas. Nobody had any kerosene. So yeah, they had to arrange for the fuel ahead of time. So it's difficult to emphasize how much of a big deal this flight was. This is covered in all the newspapers, in all the aviation magazines and other publications. There was a big lighted billboard in Times Square. There was one of the department stores had a big display in their window about it, and all the editorials were saying, well, Canada's poised to give the American aerospace industry a run for its money. They really have something special, and if they get on it, they can absolutely dominate this new field. They are years ahead. And things just kept getting better because they started getting, Avro started getting a lot of offers from different airlines, especially American Airlines, who wanted to buy 4. They started drawing up a contract. They had an option for 6 more. In fact, Dixon Spies, I actually don't know how his name is pronounced. Dixon Spies, the assistant to the president of American Airlines, quit his job and went to Avro to work as one of their sales representatives. That's how enthusiastic he was about the jetliner. They got interest from the U.S. military. They took the jetliner to Wright Field in Ohio for Materiel Command to fly it around, and they said, we want 20 of these as navigation trainers. The original aircraft was meant to carry 20 passengers, but as built, it could carry up to 50, depending on the configuration of the seats. They were proposing stretched variants that could carry up to 60 people, long-range fuel tanks, double-slotted flaps on the second prototypes for greater short-field performance, all sorts of things. And for the military, they were going to build strategic airlift transports, paratroop carriers, navigation and bombing trainers, and even tankers for in-flight refueling. Like, everybody wanted to use this aircraft for something. Well, except for the Canadian government, as is always the case. So unfortunately, even though in early 1951, things seemed to be going really, really well for Avro, the previous June, the Korean War had broken out, and the priority shifted to the CF-100, which was having major problems with its production. The first prototype had crashed, killing the pilot, and they had found serious cracking issues in the wing joints that they were trying to figure out. And yeah, they were desperately behind schedule. And so C.D. Howe and Fred Smythe said, okay, no, we cannot devote any more resources to the jetliner program. You're going to scrap the second prototype, then under construction, and we're going to transfer all the engineers over to work on the CF-100. So once again, the jetliner was dead in the water. They had no idea whether it was going to ever be revived. Then it had an interesting reprieve, a rather weird one, because at the time, Hughes Aircraft was working on the NG-2 fire control system for the CF-100, and somebody said, hey, wouldn't the jetliner make a great test platform for that system? After all, it has similar performance and has a heck of a lot of space inside the cabin to mount test equipment. And I said, okay, that's a great idea. So on April 7th, a delegation from Avro took the jetliner and flew down to Culver City via Chicago and Denver to meet with Howard Hughes. And immediately, right as they landed, they were subjected to the intense weirdness that was Howard Hughes. So his plain green Chevrolet pulled up to the airfield and proceeded to stay there for 2 hours without him getting out. Fred Smythe was actually in the car with him. He'd flown in before. They were having some sort of extended conference, and the Avro crew is just standing there, not knowing what to do. Hughes finally comes out. He says hello, doesn't shake hands, of course, tours the aircraft inside and out, and then everybody disperses, goes back to their hotel. But then the following morning, as the Avro crew is having breakfast, Hughes calls them up and says, I want another look at the aircraft. So they meet him again at the airfield. It makes them wait another 2 hours in his car, comes out and says, I want a demonstration flight. So Don Rogers shows them the controls. They take off. Hughes takes the controls, takes the jetliner and a couple of circuits of the airfield, lands. He's in love. Loves the thing. He says, I want these for TWA. I want to run them on the Chicago to New York route. He's going to do everything in his power to make it happen. Avro is very enthusiastic about this as well, but they find Hughes infuriating to deal with. For example, he would never leave any way of actually contacting him. He would always call you at all hours of day or night. If he wanted to meet with you, he'd like park his car in an alley and you'd have to go and find him. On one occasion, they were with Hughes in his penthouse at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and he excuses himself to go to the washroom and proceeds to stay there for an hour and a half. And when they ask what's going on, his assistant says, oh, he's got telephones in there. He's just conducting business. So yeah, very hard to deal with. And in fact, he borrowed the jetliner for 6 months. And he sent everybody from Avro home, and he had crews on standby all across the United States in case he wanted to go somewhere, just on standby for months. And in fact, one guy who was based in Boston completed an entire course at MIT without ever hearing from Hughes. The higher-ups at Avro still weren't interested. They said, no, we're focusing on the CF-100. So Hughes said, okay, I will get Convair to build it under license. So he gets Convair to draft up a feasibility study. They say, yes, absolutely. If we have approval by November 1st of this year, we can get the first ones off the line in spring of 1954. Hughes says, great. Him and Floyd Odlum, who was a major industrialist. He was also the husband of Jackie Cochran, first woman to break the sound barrier. They go to the U.S. government. U.S. government says, no, Convair is already full up with U.S. government military contracts. That's a no-go. Hughes's Hail Mary plan is he begs and pleads with Avro to build him his first 30 jetliners, and then he'll find somebody else to build them. Avro says no. The project is dead once again. And from here on, the jetliner is mainly used as a photography platform for the trials of the CF-100. Here we have the canopy release, also ejection, rocket firing, all sorts of things. And by 1953, the CF-100 project is pretty much back online. They've got production all figured out. And there are some half-hearted attempts to resurrect the jetliner with some improvements, but really nothing ever comes of it. The jetliner continues to fly until November 23rd, 1956, when Fred Smythe issues this memo, which tells them to dismantle the prototype, scrap it, and as quietly as possible. The same thing that would happen to the Aero 3 years later. Now, the Avro engineers tried to donate the complete airframe to the National Aviation Museum in Ottawa. They reject it. They don't have the space to store it. And so in December, the whole thing is scrapped, except for the nose and cockpit section. They give that to the National Research Council for cockpit layout studies, and then eventually it makes its way to the museum where it resides to this day, and that's all that's left of the Jetliner project. Now, to give an idea of how much was lost in this project, these are the aircraft of closest configuration and role and when they went into service. So the first would have been the Aviation Caravelle, which first flew in 1955 but didn't enter service with Air France until 1959, and that was with the full support of the French government. So the Jetliner was at least 6 to 10 years ahead of the competition. Next, we have the BA C111, 1963, Boeing 727, 1963, and the Douglas DC-9, 1965. And adding insult to injury, when Avro went under, the Malton plant was bought out by Douglas, and they used it to produce parts for the DC-9, probably to the chagrin of many Avro old-timers. And in addition to being technologically advanced and probably a surefire market winner, it was also a remarkably economical aircraft. The whole project, from start to finish, cost only $10 million, and it was estimated it would take another $6 million or so to reach full production, after which the project would break even after only about 100 sales. Compare that with the Convair 240, which would have come out at the same time. That was a conventional piston-powered aircraft. It cost $40 million and would not have broken even until they had sold 400 aircraft. And that has nowhere near the advanced technology as the Jetliner did. So we come back to the original question: what killed the Jetliner? Well, there were a lot of factors at play: the Korean War, the emphasis on the CF-100, the production delays, things like that. Those were certainly major factors, but in the end, who I would blame as the culprit is TCA. Because, as I said, TCA did not want to be the very first North American airline to operate a jet transport. Avro should have let that be and focused its efforts on selling to other airlines, but instead, and understandably so, they wanted TCA to show at least a little bit of interest, because it kind of looks bad when your own country's flag carrier rejects your own design. Unfortunately, that strategy backfired horribly for them, because TCA was forced to justify its rejection of the Jetliner, and they did that basically by slandering the aircraft, by coming up with all sorts of excuses why it was an inferior aircraft, why it wasn't suited to their needs, and these statements were then amplified by C.D. Howe and the rest of the Canadian government until finally nobody could admit they actually liked the thing, and the project was quietly shelved. So what killed the Jetliner? Well, pretty much the same thing that always kills innovation in Canada: misplaced priorities, government interference, and the lack of vision and imagination. Thank you.